This text is from uh, my laid aside unfinished novel called Dominoes, um, and each chapter is I think named after an ESP record. This first one is Spiritual Unity. Although more or less benign in its natural state, cabbage, when cooked, stinks like a fucker. My mother, lousy cook that she was, thankfully lacked the savvy to approach cabbage as a hot plate special. This was not true of Swenson's mom. When he opened the door of their house to greet me, I was struck square in the chest by a fistful of cooked cabbage stench. It was a thick smell, but with a distinct edge, one that got deeper inside me with every breath, no matter how shallow. Hey, Chaz, Swenson said, thrusting out a large, soft hand and grinning like an idiot. Glad you made it. Come in. Come in. You drive okay? Yeah, I said, trying to breathe through my mouth. Going through the Holland Tunnel always reminds me of Homer's Odyssey, but it went okay. The cabbage fumes were so heavy inside the front room, my eyes felt as though they were going to tear up. Swenson tilted his head to the side and looked blank, like a fat dachshund begging for a sausage. He raised an index finger to his lip and winked. Shh, the old lady's asleep. I glanced into the small room and saw there was indeed an old lady, sitting upright, eyes closed on an uncomfortable-looking love seat. The chair was too big for her frame, and her slipper-shod feet dangled 6 or 7 inches off the floor. Her sightless face, smeared with white gunk, tilted toward a TV. The screen's blue light illuminated her quilted housecoat, giving a fluorescent glow to the matte plastic covering the sofa. Two big chairs crowded the room, covered with the same crap. A couple of lamps set on end tables, their shades also shrink-wrapped, but with a much shinier material. Crinkly, too. I wondered if these shields were designed to keep everything from stinking like cabbage. Probably not. Swenson tiptoed theatrically past his mom into a small, harshly lit kitchen. The appliances had a cool vintage look, white, chrome-plated, and bulbous. It was the sort of kitchen you'd expect to see in a design magazine. A kitchen where two skinny bitchmen in toque slap fight each over who makes a lighter pie crust. But this kitchen didn't smell like pies, only cabbage. Jesus, my eyes really were starting to water. Come on, man, up to the domain, Swenson said quietly. He turned the handle of a vented closet door, which opened to reveal a narrow staircase. He pulled a cord and the stairway lit up. Swenson turned to me as though expecting a comment. I rubbed my left sleeve across my eyes, blinked, and looked around. I saw the walls were filled with framed postcards advertising shows at Detroit's Grandy Ballroom. Fucking nice, I said. Full set? Oh, yeah, Swenson said, trying not to smile too broadly. All the variant colors on the Who card and everything. Some of the mailing labels are choice associations, too. There are a few good White Panther ones, plus some really heavy writers and musicians. Cool, I said, meaning it. I buy one every so often, but mostly just for shows with the Stooges or MC5. There are way too many for me to get serious about collecting them. They look great, though, especially framed like that. Are they chronological? Absolutely. When concerts got canceled, I put the actual show second and the Phantom show first. It all starts in the upper left. Very nice, I said. Grimshaw's art on those is amazing. Too bad Russ Gibbs didn't have cash to do proper posters on all of them. They'd be a lot hipper to have than a bunch of Fillmore and Family Dog reprints. The posters I've seen are cool, Swenson said, but I feel like postcards capture the essence of the whole Motor City thing better. They're more immediate, like the heat was so heavy they could never put up posters without having them torn down immediately, or it was like, man, we don't even have time to do posters. We're too busy rolling bones, shooting cops, and fucking in the streets. I closed the door behind me. The cabbage smell diminished a little. Swenson turned and headed up the stairs. I heard music playing in the distance. Swenson's ass looked enormous as he plodded his way to the top. I wondered if my ass looked so titanic from the same viewpoint. Probably. The stairway made a few turns, then dumped us into a room filled with fatzos. 6 tubby guys in beanbag chairs took up half the floor space. My people. Ugh. Fahey's Death of the Clayton Peacock sparkled solemnly from the stereo. Everyone's eyes were glued to some obscure-looking 60s variety show playing in slow motion on a big screen TV. A band played soundlessly but with wild gestures in front of the show's studio backdrop, a cheesy metallic rainbow and a jumble of cardboard cacti. I didn't recognize the show or the group. They wore almost matching jean suits, had one of those big Hammond B3s, and looked scruffy as hell. The bass player's hair hung almost to his knees, and the lead singer writhed in a freaky Iggy come Morrison way. It was great, and I watched the screen for a minute or two. Okay, I give, who the fuck is it? Swenson smiled. A Corpus Christi band called Knob. They were started by the original bassist from Josephus right after he got out of the nut house. All they did were some demos in this TV thing. Bill Miller from Cold Sun tracked them down. I think he played some Texas Shittown Festival with them in the early 70s. There was supposed to be an album of their collected work, but I haven't heard anything about it for a while. I had to buy this footage from a limey dealer, but it looks totally choice. I agreed. It was choice. The same could not be said of the room's inhabitants. I couldn't remember any names, but the faces were familiar from record fairs. Guys who get heavily into mouth breathing when they flip through a good run of albums. They try to act casual, but the blood rushes to their cheeks as spit bubbles form in the corners of their mouths. Here, stretched out on Swenson's soft chair collection, they looked like pale bumps sprouting directly out of the colorful bags. Each made a wan gesture of greeting when Swenson loudly announced my arrival, then returned to focus on the splendor of Knob. This shifting of bulk resulted in an unparalleled display of ass crack, pasty flesh bumps, and obscure promotional slogans. I thought of the Alan Silva is BYG t-shirt I wore under my jean jacket. I tugged the shirt's edges down a little. If it made me look this shitty, I better keep the jacket on. Sit down, man, Swenson said. Make yourself to hum. You want some pirate's punch? Noticing most of the recumbent collectors were clutching big gulp cups, I nodded my assent and plopped down onto putrid green vinyl. It was spectacularly ugly, but quite comfortable after my bumpy drive to this obscure Brooklyn neighborhood. I sank into its greenness and realized the smell of cabbage was almost gone. In its place was a scent more animal than vegetable, although it did have a somewhat earthy quality. Swenson brought me a cup of the punch. It was in a big gulp container depicting Linda Carter as Wonder Woman. This your new scavenging focus? I asked, examining the design. God bless eBay, Swenson replied, turning his eyes skyward. The 76 and 77 special editions are classics of plastic soft drink art. The ones they did with secondary characters are unreal. I'm doing an essay on them for Cup Collector Quarterly. The guy in the beanbag closest to mine groaned and turned to face me. I should have known his name. I'd sold him enough records over the years, but I couldn't conjure it up. He was wearing a Roxy Music French tour t-shirt. It had a crude drawing of an unattractive woman in a garter belt, with a little voice balloon declaring, "Pour votre plaisir." It was at least 2 sizes too small, and the way it rode up his belly made it appear if he was girded with a thick belt of silly putty. "Hey, Chaz!" His tone was either slightly drunk or he was trying to come off as authoritatively hip. "I really, really dug your Terry Reid piece in Mojo. You completely nailed the fetid scent of dead air hanging over everything in '73. Thanks, man. That year sucked the life out of me." "Me too." "Yeah, what happened?" He paused for a moment, looked at me stupidly. I realized he was drunker than originally suspected. Nothing I can remember." Well, maybe that is the essential essence of what 1973. Nothing happened. At least nothing good happened. I began my Can 73 rap. I mean, there was a huge pile of bands I'd once loved who decided to suck that year. The Dead, the Airplane, the Byrds, Zappa, Floyd, Quicksilver, Tim Buckley, Traffic. The list is fucking endless. They were all releasing Vom, and it gets worse. The Bonzos were gone. The Velvets were gone. The Nice had become EL fucking P. The Stooges were failed anomalies whose albums nobody liked except as jokes. Imports were mostly hard to find and expenses. The few consolations were oases in vast deserts of shit. I mean, I don't know who you were listening to, but the general consensus where I lived pointed towards dogs. The Allmans, Hillbilly Era Dead, Leon Russell, Yes, Deep Purple, Bowie. The scope of dullage was crippling, unless you could swallow Glam's bullshit. And that's the stuff that was hip. The only real revelations were in the cutout bins. You must remember how dry it was. "Yeah, man," he mumbled. "Like you said, dry." He slurped his drink. I started mine. It was sweet. Jesus, it was very, very sweet. I tasted rum and pineapple juice and some other juice. Papaya, maybe coconut milk? Maybe grenadine? This shit had everything you'd need for a pirate-sized hangover and rotten fucking teeth thrown into the bargain. I'd better be careful not to have more than a couple. "More grog, Jimmy!" my nameless customer bellowed, waving his incredible Hulk cup in the air. Swenson came over and took his outstretched cup. "You digging these, Mitch?" Mitch grinned and belched in appreciation. Swenson moved towards a corner where he had a little bar set up. I hoisted myself out of beanie comfort and walked over to watch him pour ingredients into a blender. He looked like a scientist as he measured the various sugary liquids. I didn't disturb him until he capped and revved up the blender. I don't believe any of these guys is Kissinger. I gestured with my shoulder at the bean-bound citizens behind us. As pleasant as it is to spend quality time with my peers, I am here to work on my pearls before swine research. The ESP essay is already late. You know that. Kissinger's momentarily hogtied by some family shit his sister dropped on him. Last minute like, but he called, and he said he'll definitely be here later. A couple of his running buddies from the village days are going to come with him. They may even bring acoustic axes and treat us to some real old-time jam action. He was excited. Suddenly I felt exhausted. That sounds fun and all, but what about the Q&A thing? I've got all my shit here. I pointed at my backpack. No sweat, man. Tonight is just for hanging loose, getting to know each other a little. There's intensive archaeology time set apart for tomorrow. Plus, I figured having these old guys around might shake out some good stories. You know, You could tape the whole thing tonight while we relax. I'm sure you'll get some excellent quotes out of it. The formal sit-down's all arranged for a diner in Staten Island. The guy is very cool and he wants to talk. I think the last person who interviewed him was Lillian Roxon back in '67 or something. I nodded and shrugged my shoulders at the same time. Excellent quotes. I bet. Whatever. What fucking ever. It was clear this phase of my ESP project had a trajectory as flawed as all the others. What a surprise. I had started working on this magnum opus 2 years ago when a small-time record mogul asked me to compile the definitive album and book set about the defunct ESP disc label. Amongst collectors, I was considered something of an expert on the topic, but it was not the cakewalk I'd expected. I drove, phoned, and emailed endless questions to the musicians I could find. These queries were usually met either by silence, lies, or profound memory loss. When the idea for the project had first sprung on me, I interpreted it as a sign things were going to cohere, make sense, maybe even improve. I saw it as a way to recast myself as a true authority on one aspect of the American underground culture. I tried to predict which of NPR's genial hosts would interview me. Now I just wanted to hit my word count and get the damn thing finished. If Roger Christinger failed to materialize, it just meant I could put a big O next to another name in my notebook. Tried and failed, tried and failed, tried and failed. The phrase had a nice rhythm, like one of those chants would shout while we goose-stepped back to dinner at Boy Scout camp when I was a kid. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly through my nose. I imagined a column of surly 12-year-olds in green uniforms moving briskly down a dusty road. They got closer to me and halted their two-step. The kid in front was a buzz-cut blonde with thick glasses. He raised his right middle finger crisply to his forehead and snapped it back down to his side. "Fuck you, sir!" He said it with authority, and the kids around him behind followed suit. Their voices boomed out together, and the surrounding woods echoed their words. "Fuck you, sir!" I opened my eyes and looked around. Yeah, fuck me. Fuck me and the horse I rode in on. My idiotic drive into the heart of ESP had actually begun when I was about the age of those scouts, 30 years ago. I walked into a rat-trapped Times Square record store. The bins held what must have been the entire ESP catalog, priced at 99 cents a disc. It was a life-changing experience. It was Thanksgiving break my first year at prep school. Earlier that fall, a friend had given me my first taste of the Fugs. I was a 14-year-old hepcat in training, and the Fugs hooked me instantly. Their music was filled with cussing, drug references, and chaos of every description. This was exactly what I sought, desperately, from records, from books, from movies. At times, I caught glimpses of spine-tingling cultural weirdness in the pages of Playboy, but the crazier things they wrote about proved impossibly elusive. I could never get my hands on the actual goods. To be in the very same room as that Fugs album, with songs like Coca-Cola Douche and CIA Man, was staggering. I had to have that record. but it was on a label I'd never heard of, ESP, and none of the big department stores I frequented carried it in their music sections. Nor, it seemed, could they special order it. I was stunned to see it displayed in the front of the bin of this dingy hole in the wall. I was even more shocked to realize the place was jammed to the tits with nothing but ESP albums. Stark black and white cover photos were everywhere I looked. The potential left me breathless. The deal the store offered was nuts. 99 cents a piece or 12 for $10. $10? I spent that much on the Woodstock soundtrack. But the selection process was overwhelming. I combed the racks for hours, seeking clues about sounds, marveling at the strangeness of it all. Finally, with only minutes remaining until my bus back to New Jersey, I chose a batch and fled towards the Port Authority terminal, promising myself I would return for another dozen as soon as humanly possible. I continued to scrutinize the record's liner notes and cover images in the back of Jersey Trails number 32. Some were obviously rock music, others were definitely not, but they were all bizarre, and I sensed the specifics didn't matter. ESP looked like a brand I could trust. The music world's version of Grove Press. A Grove Press paperback was always exciting, whether a rant about the ills of Western society, a screwed-up science fiction novel, or unabashed porno. Parts of the actual writing might confound me, but the vibe never did. I even dug the Victorian smut they published. The big thrill for many of those books' rich boys' protagonist was tying up a maid and whipping her nipples. I didn't find this image overwhelmingly sexy, yet its mysteries intrigued me. They hinted at areas of knowledge, tradition, pleasure, and secrecy about which I knew nothing. This gave me an odd sense of hope. I also knew my parents' Nixon's-loving pea-brains would explode if they ever read a word of it, which was as important as anything else. ESP albums promised a similar aura. Anticipation chewed at me as the bus rumbled through the commercial flats of North Jersey. When we started to roll into the hill country, nearing the end of my journey, I felt my skin flush the way it did when I'd gotten a new issue of Playboy, but hadn't actually had a chance to sample the contents. The weight was savory and maddening at the same time, often more interesting than the magazine. That would not be the case this time. I was certain of it. Any record label wild enough to embrace the Fugs had to be thoroughly subversive. No two ways about it. The bus finally disgorged me in front of the Kinlawn Bowl. November was always the shittiest month in this part of the world. Cold, wet, windy, and gray, the sky forever threatening to fill my penny loafers with slush. But the two white bags holding my booty felt radiant as I hitchhiked home. Their warmth enveloped me, and I started to feel positively high as I trudged the last half mile up our road. Happily, the house was empty. I recalled something about my sister doing an organ recital at church or some such shit. Hopefully it would take a long time. Once in my room, I closed and locked the door, opened the bags, and slid the records onto my mod-striped bedspread. First, I stacked the covers face down, since a couple of them had no right. I sorted them into alphabetical order and flipped them over into two rows of six. There was one by Albert Eiler, three by the Fugs, two by the Gods, one by Sonny Murray, two by Pearls Before Swine, one by Sun Ra, one by Patty Waters, and one that was a sampler. After careful consideration, I decided to put the sampler last rather than inserting it into the sequence alphabetically. They looked so good in their shrink wrap, I didn't want to open them right away. I touched them, turned them over one by one, almost in a trance, just digging their vibe, the way they felt in my hands, even the way they smelled. There was no mistaking their underground origin. They had the heft of objects crafted exclusively for adult bohemians. A whole new level of cultural heaviness formed in my mind, knocking Captain Beefheart and the Velvet Underground down a notch. You could get those records at Corvettes. These ones were only available to people willing to search the city's darkest corners. Being cool wasn't easy, but man, it was sure worth the effort. I was still in an appreciative fugue state when my family got home from church, so there was no chance to spin my treasures until later. We ate dinner in noisy silence and watched Jackie Gleason as we did every Saturday night. My parents asked a lot of questions about my first solo trip to New York. It seemed like a big deal to them, but I was already blasé about the whole thing. It had been uneventful, although the Christmas windows at Macy's did look pretty great, and I always got a kick out of that huge tree they put up in Rockefeller Center. But my big moment had been the discovery of that store. Even if they'd wanted, there was no way to translate that experience into terms they'd understand. I mumbled monosyllables which satisfied everyone. Finally, they went to bed, and I scooted down to the basement, turned on the stereo, and stacked the first three albums on the turntable. The Eiler thing was crazed. The main part of it was played on a saxophone that sounded like it was broken or being force-fed air by a jet engine. The guy was obviously nuts, or more stoned than any human had a right to be. I shot a couple of racks of pool balls trying to figure out what was going on. I'd taken 8 goddamn years of piano lessons, but this saxophone wasn't playing notes I'd be able to write down on paper. Some parts sounded like they were taken from hymns or marches, but it didn't really make any sense at all. Damn, it was great. The Fugs were next. I knew their work, of course, but it sounded freshly radical down here, echoing off the shuffleboard court my dad and I had laid into the basement floor. I stared at the tiles decorated with sea nymphs and bearded mermen holding tridents. To hear the words, moans, and curses of these New York beatniks bouncing around this bourgeois hell zone was intensely gratifying. I stayed up all night listening to these fantastic records. Heard sequentially, they made something click inside my head, altering the way I shaped my thoughts, as surely as the electric Kool-Aid acid test did when I read it earlier that year. Tom Wolfe's Saga of the Merry Pranksters provided concrete evidence it was possible to survive into adulthood and still be a maniac. These records made me understand implicitly, instantly, an entire universe existed in opposition, or at least at an acute angle to the universe my parents inhabited. When I looked at all the pictures of those other ESP albums, it was hard to contain the joy I felt merely knowing these albums were objects I might actually obtain and learn from. I had always loved Atlantic Records inner sleeves because they were decorated with miniature reproductions of previously released records. These were mostly obscure soul and R&B albums, but there was usually an intriguing oddball title hidden amongst the early Aretha Franklin sides. Dr. John's Gree or Tom Sankey's The Golden Screw. Some of the ESP's back covers had similar depictions of their back catalog, but they were all intriguing, all oddball, and I had actually fondled most of these records already in that goddamn store. These pictures made my brain feel like it was on fire, in a nice way. I wanted to scream I'd been enlightened. I wanted to destroy everything around me, but I didn't want to wake my parents, so I just went to sleep. From that day forward, relative intimacy with the ESP catalog was how I tested the hipness of preppies who tried to strike up a music conversation. If they were rock fans, I'd ask what they thought of the Gods, clearly the most viciously anarchic rock group ever. If they said they liked jazz, I'd ask about Isler or Sonny Murray or Sun Ra. If my query made them stumble, I sneered inwardly, fat and sassy in my mastery of supremely arcane knowledge. These assholes thought they were with it? Faw. I spent my meager funds trying to dig up as many of the label's records as I could, speculating endlessly about the ones I couldn't find. It wasn't an obsession, really. I was just so amazed, so goddamn tickled there was this thriving, somewhat systematized world lurking under reality's dull as wooden teeth surface. I wanted to gobble it down whole. I wanted its essence to be a burning star core in the center of my interior galaxy. I wanted to own it, in an almost mystical sense, and in my own little way I suppose I did. Searching the magazine files of the school library, I discovered back issues of Downbeat and Jazz and Pop. I pored over these every evening after dinner, lapping up facts about peoples whose name I now recognized. I'd gotten a catalog from ESP by sending a self-addressed stamped envelope to their New York address, and I filled the back of my Latin notebook with information. I listed all the musicians, added anything I could find out about them, who they played with, their birth dates, concert schedules, whatever. I had to start a whole separate notebook for it after a couple of weeks, because some of those guys had done a lot of stuff. But I was persistent. By the time Christmas break arrived, I had a full ESP checklist and was ready to hit that store like a hurricane. Christmas money in hand, I returned to the city and bought 36 albums in one fell swoop. It was so much stuff, the guy there had to put them in a box. It was so heavy, I had to call my mom for a ride when I got off the bus. But I didn't care. I was fully immersed in the underground, even if I didn't have a driver's license. I spent the rest of my vacation studying those records. Notebook at the ready, I wrote commentary about each song and made lists of musicians to investigate further. By the time I returned to school, I knew the ESP story cold. My own half-baked version of it, anyway. This became the armor plating for my self-esteem. Nobody else really cared, of course, but my own insufferable attitude was reward enough. If one of the other students at the school's radio station mentioned how heavy the new Neil Young album was, I might quip, "Yeah, but have you heard Ed Askew's Red Woman? It is a motherfucker." Because these guys were no less dorky, no less unsure of themselves than I was, they would nod and agree, even though I might as well have been speaking Swahili. But they were music fans. They all knew a little bit about the ESP label and agreed, at least in theory, it was the last word in mind-blowing shitteroo. My sure-footed familiarity with the material lent me a certain cachet. I admit it was with a socially retarded crowd, but hey, any cachet at all was pretty pleasant. I wallowed in that which was afforded me. first concrete fallout of my newfound stature came early in 1970. I was doing my campus radio show, Develop the Hobbit, every Thursday night from 7 to 8, when a girl named Sherry called the studio. She said she thought I was playing some very far-out music and invited me to the next meeting of the Toad Lick Express, the school's mimeographed underground broadsheet. I had seen Sherry a few times at the Paperpotamus, a small book and record store where I hung out and hoped to work someday. She wasn't a fox, but she wasn't a dog either, if you know what I mean. I was surprised by her question and asked what was up. She said they were looking for someone to write music reviews for the Toad. The Toad's previous music critic, Siebert Ebersol, had just been expelled for lobbing a Molotov cocktail at the headmaster's house. The thing hadn't been lit, but it was still a very righteous act on Siebert's part. His decision to join the revolution was one many of us talked about, and I respected him a lot for being serious enough to do it. Word on campus was that afterwards he calmly walked back to his dorm room, fired up a joint, put on the Jefferson Airplane's volunteers, and waited for the pigs to come get him. They probably took him to Holderness. That's where most of the kids who got kicked out seemed to end up. It was supposed to be pretty strict and way out in the New Hampshire boonies. Sounded like hell, even if they were supposed to have a very good Latin program. I had a strong feeling of political solidarity with Siebert, but that didn't mean I was seriously considering skipping the opportunity to take his place. This sounded like a dream come true. Writing about music. Sherry told me the next meeting was Saturday afternoon in one of the rooms on the 4th floor in the library. I was so excited I screwed up the cue on the Sun Ra record I was planning to play, but I didn't care. This was like the coolest thing ever. Well, that's been quite a while now. I think you're probably all ready for a little nap, and that should be fun.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Ed, for lighting up my life.
Everybody.
Uh,
Oh, that was good. We made it. We did it. Thank you all for coming and making it a beautiful night. As always, means a lot.
It was very enjoyable, you guys.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that was great.
Really great.
amazing.
Village of Spaces is next week, so everyone get prepared for that, and that will be exciting. Other good performers next week is, onward that we have booked, and that's, getting more and more exciting. And thank you all for coming, and I'll leave the info one more time for the donation. And if you didn't get it, you can always email me, and I think that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions. No?